Victor Hale set the papers on the mahogany table like he was doing the family a favor. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He walked into the Whitmore parlor with two men behind him, snow still melting off his coat, and he dropped that leather folder in front of Mabel's father like a verdict. "Sign it," he said, "or I take the house by morning." Mabel stood near the window. She watched her father's hands shake as he reached for the papers. 63 years old, gray at the temples. A man who had built a railroad fortune from nothing, and now his fingers trembled like a child's. Victor's eyes moved to Mabel. He looked at her the way men like him always did. A slow, calculating survey. Not desire. Assessment, like he was pricing livestock at an auction. "The girl marries me," he said, still looking at her. "That's the condition. That's how the debt disappears." Nobody in that room called it what it was. But Mabel knew. If you've ever felt like the world decided your worth before you opened your mouth, hit that subscribe button, because this story was made for you. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. This channel carries stories that don't let go, and I promise you, you don't want to miss what happens next. The morning Victor Hale came to collect, Mabel had already been awake for 2 hours. She wasn't a heavy sleeper by nature. Never had been. Even as a child, she would lie in the dark and listen to the house breathe. The creak of the floorboards, the wind finding gaps in the window frames, the sound of her father's footsteps when he thought no one could hear him pacing. That morning, she had heard him pacing since before 4 o'clock. She pulled herself out of bed and stood at the window. Denver in January looked like something that had given up. The streets below were gray and frozen, the sky the color of old dishwater, and the few people moving through the cold walked with their shoulders hunched like they were bracing for more bad news. Mabel looked at her own reflection in the glass for a moment and then looked away. She had stopped spending long stretches of time in front of mirrors about 4 years ago, not because she hated what she saw. That would have required a kind of passion she didn't feel about it anymore, but because the reflection had never matched what she felt inside, and at some point the gap between the two became too exhausting to keep examining. She was large. She had always been large. Her mother had called it sturdy when she was small, which Mabel had understood even then was a word chosen to spare feelings. Society had less gentle vocabulary for it. She had heard most of those words by the time she was 14. She put on her dress, the gray wool one, practical, high-necked, and went downstairs. Her father was in the study. She could see him through the half-open door, sitting behind his desk with a glass of something in his hand that wasn't coffee. He was a proud man, Thomas Whitmore. He wore his pride the way other men wore their Sunday suits. Carefully, always, even when it was uncomfortable. Seeing him sitting there like that, diminished, smaller than she remembered, made something in Mabel's chest go tight. She pushed the door open. "Papa." He looked up. For just a moment, something crossed his face. Shame, she thought. The particular shame of a father who cannot protect his child. Then he rearranged his expression into something more composed. "You should eat breakfast," he said. "It's not even 5 in the morning. Then you should still be in bed. You've been walking the floor since 3. She came in and sat across from him. The fire in the grate had burned low. Nobody had tended it. "Tell me what's happening." Thomas Whitmore set his glass down and was quiet for a long moment. The story came out in pieces. It had been building for months, he said. Longer, maybe. But he hadn't wanted to alarm her. Victor Hale had invested heavily in the railroad expansion, alongside her father and 3 other partners. The terms had seemed solid. Backed by legitimate federal contracts, surveyed land, signed agreements. Thomas had put in everything he had. Not out of recklessness, he said. He had done his due diligence. He had trusted men he had worked with for 15 years. But Victor Hale had been operating on a different set of agreements the entire time. Agreements no one else had seen. The contracts were fraudulent. The land surveys had been altered. When the scheme collapsed, the debt had been structured so that it flowed downward, away from Victor, away from the men at the top, and settled squarely on the shoulders of the men who had trusted them. Men like Thomas Whitmore. Mabel listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How much?" He told her. She didn't let herself react visibly, though the number sat in her stomach like a stone. "And Hale is coming this morning," she said, "at 8 o'clock. What does he want?" Her father looked at his glass. "He has a proposal." She already knew it wasn't a proposal at all. Men like Victor Hale didn't propose things. They arrived with conditions dressed up in polite language, and you either accepted them or you watched everything you had built get stripped down to the walls. Victor arrived at 7:55. He was the kind of man who was always precisely on time in a way designed to demonstrate that he was never waiting on anyone. He was handsome in the way that certain predators are handsome. Clean lines, expensive clothes, a confidence that never flickered. He had pale eyes that seemed to process everything around him without any warmth at all. He brought two men with him who stood near the door and didn't speak. Mabel had positioned herself in the parlor rather than retreating upstairs the way her mother had. Her mother was upstairs. Her younger brother was upstairs. Mabel had stayed because it seemed important that someone in this house stand their ground on the ground floor. Victor looked at her when he entered and did the thing with his eyes, that slow assessment, and then he looked away as if she were furniture he had already catalogued. He sat down without being invited. "Thomas," he said, with the familiarity of someone who had been a trusted friend rather than the architect of a financial disaster. Her father's jaw was tight. "Victor, I assume Mabel knows the situation." "I know it," Mabel said. Victor's eyes moved back to her briefly, registering mild surprise that she had spoken first. "Good," he said. "That simplifies things." He laid out the terms with the practiced ease of a man who had delivered difficult news before and found it had no particular effect on him. The debt was real. The documentation was thorough. Legal proceedings were already in motion. Within 60 days, the Whitmore family home, the remaining business assets, and any personal property above a minimum threshold would be transferred to cover the obligation. Unless. He let the word sit there. "Unless," he continued, "we reach a private arrangement, I'm prepared to absorb the full debt, all of it, erased, no further proceedings, in exchange for a single condition." His pale eyes moved to Mabel. She felt her skin go cold. "A marriage," he said. "Mabel and I would wed within 30 days. The family retains the house and a reasonable monthly income. The debt disappears." The room was very quiet. Mabel looked at Victor Hale's face and understood something clearly. He was not a man who wanted a wife. He was a man who wanted a particular kind of leverage, wrapped in a domestic arrangement that society would accept without question. A large, unmissable woman with no social currency, married to a powerful man. No one would look twice at whatever happened inside that house. She understood it in her bones. Before she could speak, before her father could respond, the front door opened. They all turned. The man who came through the door was not what anyone in that room expected. He was very large. Not in the way Victor's hired men were large, not manufactured bulk meant to intimidate. This man was built by years of outdoor living, by weather and labor and survival. He had a scar that ran from his left jaw down beneath his collar. His coat was heavy frontier wool, still carrying traces of mountain cold. He tracked melting snow across the Whitmore carpet without seeming to notice it. He looked at Victor Hale first. Then he looked around the room until he found Mabel, and he held her gaze for just a moment. Not aggressively, not with assessment, something more like recognition. Then he opened his coat, removed a folded document, and set it on the table next to Victor's leather folder. "Ronan Blackwood," he said, not introducing himself to the room exactly, just placing his name into the air so everyone knew which piece of this they were dealing with. Victor stared at the document. His expression, for the first time, changed. Something moved through his pale eyes that Mabel had not seen there before. It was very close to alarm. "That's not possible," Victor said. "Checked with your lawyers this morning," Ronan said. His voice was low and even, without particular drama. "It's possible." Mabel's father reached for the document with unsteady hands and read it. His face shifted through several things she couldn't entirely track. "He purchased the debt," her father said quietly. "Not to anyone in particular. All of it." Mabel stared at Ronan Blackwood. Victor stood up. The composure was back in place, but thinner now, like ice over water that wasn't quite frozen through. "You have no business in this." "I have every legal business in this," Ronan said. "The debt belongs to me now, which means your arrangement," he nodded toward the leather folder, "is no longer relevant." Victor looked at Mabel with something that wasn't quite anger. It was the look of a man recalculating, reassigning blame, storing information for later use. Then he picked up his folder, nodded to his men, and left. He didn't slam the door. "That," somehow, was worse. Mabel turned to Ronan Blackwood. She had 100 questions and no idea which one to start with. He spoke before she could. "I also have a condition," he said. Of course he did. She had just been transferred from one man's arrangement to another's, and the only variable that had changed was which man was making demands. Something must have crossed her face because he looked at her steadily and said, "You can say no. I want to be clear about that up front. This isn't Victor Hale's offer with different wrapping." "What's the condition?" she said. "Marriage." She almost laughed. It came out as a short, humorless breath through her nose. "Why," she said flatly, "would I trade one marriage I don't want for another one I don't want?" "Because one of them leaves your family with their home and a man who'll treat you with respect," he said, "and the other one doesn't." She studied him, the scar, the steadiness, the fact that he hadn't looked at her the way Victor had, hadn't inventoried her, hadn't dismissed her. He had looked at her like she was a person he was speaking to. She hated how much that small thing mattered. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you want this? Why would you spend that kind of money to—" She gestured vaguely at the situation. "This?" Something shifted in his expression, not quite discomfort, something more considered. "There are reasons," he said. "I'm going to need more than that." "I know." He held her gaze. "I'll tell you the rest when we're clear of Denver, when there's no one listening who can use it." Her mother had come downstairs at some point during all of this and was standing in the doorway. Mabel could hear her controlled, careful breathing. Her father was sitting with the document in his hands, like a man who had been handed a lifeline by a stranger and wasn't sure yet whether to be grateful or afraid. Mabel looked at Ronan Blackwood one more time. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. He wasn't trying to be. There was something in his face that had been simplified by whatever years he had spent in the mountains, worn down to the essential, without the layering of performance and management that covered most men's faces. She didn't trust him. She wasn't built to trust someone on an hour's acquaintance, but she believed, with something that operated slightly below conscious thought, that he was telling her the truth about what he was, which was more than she could say for Victor Hale. 30 days? She said. "We leave in 3 days," he said. "The mountains close hard in February. We need to get ahead of it." 3 days. Mabel looked around the parlor, the familiar furniture, the worn rug her mother had argued with her father about for 6 months before he finally agreed to have it replaced, the painting above the fireplace that she had grown up barely seeing because it had always simply been there. This house had never been entirely comfortable for her. Too many rooms where the wrong thing was always just barely not being said. Too many meals where someone's eyes moved to her plate. Too many conversations about her future that had, underneath them, a current of doubt. As if everyone in the room suspected her future would require accommodating, but it was the house she knew. "Where are we going?" she asked. "North," Ronan said. "High country, my land." "How far?" 4 days' ride if the weather holds. She nodded slowly. She was aware in a distant way that she was not panicking. She thought she probably should be. A stranger had just purchased her family's debt and presented her with a marriage proposal in the same conversation, and she was standing here asking logistical questions as if she were planning a supply run. Maybe she had already used up her capacity for panic in the 2 hours before dawn when she had stood at the window watching the gray city and felt the last version of her life sliding away. Or maybe the version of her life that was sliding away had never been truly hers to begin with. 3 days, she said. Ronan Blackwood nodded. He picked up his coat and moved toward the door, pausing briefly. He turned back not to her father, not to her mother, to her. "Pack for cold," he said. "Real cold. Not what you think is cold. What you actually can't imagine yet." Then he left. Mabel stood in the quiet parlor with her father's shaking hands and her mother's careful breathing and the snow still melting into the carpet where a mountain man had stood. She had 3 days to pack for a life she had never imagined. She started a list in her head immediately. Not because she was calm, because it was the only thing she knew how to do. The 3 days passed faster than Mabel expected and slower than she could stand. She packed in the evenings, after her mother had gone to bed, because she couldn't do it with her mother watching. Eleanor Whitmore had a particular way of standing in doorways that communicated suffering without a single word, and Mabel didn't have the reserves for it. She needed her hands to be busy and her mind to be quiet, and she couldn't have either with her mother's grief occupying the room. She took practical things. Wool stockings, 2 heavy skirts, her warmest underthings, which weren't warm enough. She understood that now, from the way Ronan had said it. Real cold. Not what you think is cold. She took her sewing kit because it was small and useful. She took the book her father had given her on her 15th birthday, not because she expected to have time for reading, but because leaving it behind felt like leaving a piece of herself she wasn't ready to abandon yet. She did not take her good dresses. She looked at them hanging in the wardrobe for a long moment, the blue silk, the cream wool with the embroidered collar, the dark green one her mother had insisted on having made, even though Mabel had said it was too expensive, and she closed the wardrobe door. Those dresses had never made her feel beautiful. They had made her feel like she was trying. On the second night, her father came to sit with her. He didn't offer to help her pack. He just sat in the chair near the window and watched her fold things, and for a while neither of them spoke. That was one of the things she had always valued about her father. Even now, even after the revelation of his catastrophic miscalculation, he had never required her to fill silence with reassurance. "You know you don't have to do this," he said finally. She kept folding. "We've been over this. I can find another way." She looked at him then. He was aging in the past 3 days in a way that she found difficult to look at directly. The collapse of a man's pride was not a dignified thing to witness, even when you loved him. "Papa," she said carefully, "what other way?" He didn't answer. "I'm not angry," she said, and she meant it, which surprised her a little. She had expected to find anger underneath everything, but when she went looking for it, it wasn't there. What she found instead was something more complicated, a kind of grief, and beneath that, an unexpected clarity. "I'm going to be all right." "You don't know that." "No," she agreed. "But I don't know the opposite either." He left after another hour, without having resolved anything, which was the honest version of the conversation. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated false comfort. Ronan came for her at first light on the third day. He arrived with 2 horses and a pack mule loaded with supplies, and he waited in the street without coming to the door, which Mabel only discovered because she happened to look out the window while tying her hair back. She had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something more ceremonial, maybe. Some acknowledgement of the weight of what was being set in motion. Instead, there was a large, quiet man standing in the frozen street with 3 animals, waiting. She brought her trunk downstairs herself. Ronan came up the walk when he saw her struggling with it at the door, not with commentary, just with his hands. He took one end without asking. They carried it out together. Her mother stood in the doorway in her housecoat and did not speak. Mabel hugged her, felt the rigid way she held herself. The particular stiffness of a woman holding grief in very tightly so it wouldn't come out in front of a stranger, and then pulled back and kissed her cheek. "I'll write when I can," Mabel said. Her mother nodded. Her eyes were very bright, and she kept her jaw set. Her father shook Ronan's hand. Something passed between them, some assessment, some kind of old male reckoning that Mabel couldn't entirely read. Ronan said something low that she didn't catch. Her father nodded once. Then she mounted the horse Ronan had brought for her. A broad-backed gray mare, sturdy and calm, better suited to her weight than any horse she had ever been offered without commentary. And they rode north out of Denver as the January sky went from black to the color of dirty wool. She did not look back. She had promised herself she wouldn't, and she kept the promise, though it cost her something. They didn't talk much that first day. The cold was serious from the beginning, and Mabel was occupied with managing it, keeping her hands functional inside her gloves, adjusting her posture on the horse so the wind hit her coat rather than finding gaps, remembering to keep her face turned slightly away from the worst of it. She was not an experienced rider. She had ridden in Denver, in the controlled way of city women, in parks and on well-maintained paths. This was different. The terrain changed constantly, and the gray mare had opinions about some of it, and Mabel had to pay attention. Ronan set the pace without checking whether she could keep up. That could have been inconsiderate. She decided it wasn't. He was treating her like someone who would manage, which was different from how most people treated her, and she found she preferred it even when her thighs were burning and her lower back had begun to register a complaint that she suspected would be much louder by evening. They stopped at midday in a shallow ravine that blocked some of the wind. Ronan built a fire from materials he carried already prepared. Not a large fire, efficient, functional. and produced dried meat and hard biscuits from his pack. She ate without embarrassment, which required a small act of will because she was very hungry and was accustomed to monitoring herself when she ate in the presence of people who were watching her. Ronan wasn't watching her. He was watching the tree line. "Are we being followed?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Not yet." "Yet?" "Hale doesn't give up easily. He'll want to know where you're going." He looked back at the trees. "I've taken precautions, but we'll ride harder tomorrow." "I can manage harder," she said. He looked at her again, and this time there was something in his expression that wasn't quite surprise. Recognition, maybe. Like she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "I figured," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was something better. An observation offered without surprise or condescension. She stored it quietly and finished her biscuit. The second day was harder. They climbed steadily, and the temperature dropped in a way that was no longer politely unpleasant, but actively aggressive. Mabel's fingers went numb despite her gloves. Her face hurt. The gray mare moved carefully on the icy patches, and Mabel let her, trusting the animal's instincts more than her own. Late in the afternoon, Ronan pulled his horse alongside hers and held out something without comment. She took it. A pair of heavy, fur-lined mittens, clearly his. "Your hands," he said, which was all he said, and moved ahead again. She put them on. They were enormous on her. His hands were very large. But the warmth was almost violent in its relief. She felt her fingers begin to come back to life with a pins and needles ache that she welcomed because it meant she still had feeling. She wore his mittens for the rest of the day and said nothing else about it, and neither did he. That night they stopped at a trapper's way station, a rough structure, barely a cabin, with a wood stove and stacked firewood and a sleeping platform along one wall. Ronan made it clear without making a production of it that she would sleep on the platform and he would sleep near the stove. He gave her 2 of the blankets from the pack mule. She lay in the dark listening to the fire and the wind and thought about Victor Hale's face in the parlor. The way his expression had shifted when Ronan set those papers on the table. She had cataloged that shift and she kept returning to it. Victor was not a man who was easily surprised. Whatever Ronan Blackwood's history was, whatever had put that scar on his jaw and that particular quality of dangerous calm in his bearing, Victor had recognized it as something real. She wondered what that history was. She didn't ask. Not yet. The third day brought the storm. It arrived in the way serious mountain weather arrived, with almost no warning, or rather with warning that she didn't yet know how to read. The sky had been overcast all morning, but that had seemed like simply the sky. Ronan had been watching it differently since dawn, she realized in retrospect. He had been moving them faster. His eyes kept going up. By early afternoon, the wind had teeth in it that it hadn't had at noon. By mid-afternoon, she couldn't see more than 50 yards ahead. "We're going through the ridge crossing," Ronan said, coming alongside her. He had to raise his voice. "It's going to be narrow. Stay behind me and stay on the inside of the trail." "How narrow?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Narrow enough that you need to trust the horse more than yourself." That was honest. She appreciated honest. The ridge crossing was a path cut along the face of a steep slope, wide enough for the horses in normal conditions, barely wide enough in the conditions they were actually in. Below the outer edge was a drop that Mabel caught one glimpse of before deliberately looking away and keeping her eyes on the back of Ronan's coat. The wind hit them on the ridge like it was personal. The gray mare didn't like it. Mabel could feel the animal's tension transmitting up through the saddle, a trembling, coiled readiness, the horse's whole body poised between the trained instinct to obey and the raw animal instinct to get away from the edge. Mabel kept her hands quiet on the reins. She kept her weight centered. She breathed slowly through her nose, even though her lungs wanted to do something much more panicked. She was good with the mare because the mare needed her to be good. She didn't think about the drop. She thought about her feet in the stirrups. She thought about the position of her hands. She thought about the next 4 feet of icy trail and nothing beyond that. They were almost across. Almost. The wind changed direction without warning, a savage lateral gust that hit the mare from the outside rather than the front, and the horse lurched sideways, one rear hoof skidding on ice. And for a moment that lasted much longer than a moment, Mabel was at a 45-degree angle toward the outer edge with nothing between her and the drop below. She heard herself make a sound she didn't recognize. Not a scream, something lower and more involuntary. The mare scrambled, found purchase, but in finding it threw Mabel's weight further wrong, and she came out of the saddle. Not completely, but enough that she was sliding, her grip on the horn desperate and inadequate, the horse's shoulder hitting her as the animal tried to right itself. Ronan's hand closed around her arm. He had turned his horse somehow on that narrow trail, turned it in a space where she would have said turning wasn't possible, and he had her arm locked in both his hands, and he was not letting go. The horse found its feet. Mabel found the saddle. For several seconds she just sat there on the mare's back in the middle of the ridge in the blizzard, breathing in a way that had nothing controlled about it anymore. Ronan still had her arm. "I've got you," he said. He said it the way you said something when you needed the other person to hear it more than you needed them to respond to it. "I've got you. You're all right." "I know," she said, which was not true, but was what she had available. He didn't let go until they were off the ridge and into the shelter of the trees on the other side. And even then he kept his horse close to hers for the next hour, close enough that his knee was almost touching her stirrup, without saying anything about it. She was grateful for that, too, for the closeness without the commentary. They made camp early, tucked into a fold in the terrain that broke the worst of the wind. Ronan had a tent in the pack that went up faster than she would have thought possible, and he got a fire going in a way that seemed to defy the conditions, shielded and low and effective. He moved through all of it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times, which of course he had. Mabel sat close to the fire and let her hands stop shaking before she tried to do anything useful. She did try to be useful. She wasn't built for sitting and being tended to. She took over managing the food. It wasn't complicated, dried provisions that needed water and heat, and Ronan led her without making a gesture of it, which was the right thing to do. They ate in the windbreak of the tent, shoulder to shoulder, because there wasn't room for anything else. And for the first time since leaving Denver, she felt something that wasn't dread or cold or the low-grade exhaustion of sustained fear. She felt oddly like herself. "On the ridge," she said after a while. "How did you turn your horse in that space?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Horse knows me," he said. "Asked her to do something impossible, and she trusted me enough to try it. She didn't fall." "No." "Neither did I," Mabel said. And then, because she hadn't planned to say it, but it came out anyway, "I was sure I was going." "You weren't going anywhere," he said. It wasn't bluster. It was just a statement. She looked at the fire. "You told me I could say no," she said, "back in Denver. You said this wasn't Victor Hale's offer with different wrapping." "That's right." "I want you to tell me what the reasons are." She turned to look at him. "You said you'd tell me when we were clear of Denver. We're clear of Denver." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might be deciding not to answer. She was already composing her response to that, quiet, firm, non-negotiable, when he began to speak. He told her about Victor Hale. Not all of it. She understood from the way he spoke that there were layers he wasn't uncovering yet, but enough. He had known Victor for longer than she would have guessed. He had been watching him for the better part of 2 years, piecing together the shape of what Victor was doing, because Victor's particular way of operating had damaged someone Ronan cared about. He didn't say who. She didn't push on that specific point. What he had uncovered over those 2 years was a pattern. Victor found people with real assets and genuine reputations, men who had built things honestly, and he came alongside them as a partner. He was good at it. He was convincing, and he was patient, and he always made sure the legal structures were in place before anything collapsed, so that when it did collapse, he was the man holding the legitimate paper, while the men who had trusted him were drowning in debt they hadn't created. Her father was not the first. He would have been the last, Ronan said, because Victor had learned something, that a man with daughters was easier to leverage than a man with sons, because the world offered men an avenue of recourse that it didn't offer women, and Victor had found a way to use that. He had done it twice before. 2 families in other states. 2 women, both of them vulnerable in different ways, both of them absorbed into Victor's orbit through marriages that no one looking from the outside had questioned. Mabel sat with this for a moment. "What happened to them?" she asked. "The other women." Ronan looked at this fire. "One of them left after 3 years. She had family who helped her get out." A pause. "The other one I don't know. I've tried to find out." The fire crackled. The wind moved over the tent in long, slow waves. "So you're collecting evidence," Mabel said. "I have evidence. I've had it for months. But evidence isn't enough without someone willing to take it forward, and Victor has enough influence that the men who should act on it haven't. Not yet. His jaw shifted. I needed him not to be able to add another woman to that pattern. Not while I'm still trying to build a case that will actually stick. Mabel looked at her hands. She thought about her father's hands trembling as he reached for the papers. She thought about her mother standing in the doorway in her housecoat, holding grief in very tight so it wouldn't show. And the marriage, she said. That was the quickest way to remove you from his reach, Ronan said. A woman who is legally already married is not available for Victor's particular arrangement, and you needed somewhere to go. You could have paid the debt without the marriage. He was quiet for a moment. Yes. So why the marriage? The fire moved between them. She watched his face, which was not an easy face to read, too weathered, too practiced at not displaying things. But something was working in it. Because he would have found another approach, Ronan said finally. He would have gone after your brother, or found a different leverage point against your father. The debt was one mechanism. He has others. A married woman with a husband willing to take legal steps is harder to get at. A woman on her own in Denver with a family that's financially ruined is... He stopped. Exposed, Mabel said. Yes. She sat with this. The honesty of it. The pragmatism. It was not romantic. It was not what any story she had ever been told about marriage looked like. It was a strategic protection dressed up in legal ceremony. But it was real. And no one had asked her a real thing in a very long time. What's in this for you? She said. Past the protection, past the evidence. You spent a significant amount of money on that debt. You brought a stranger into your home. What do you get? He looked at her directly. I get someone in that house who isn't going to disappear on me, he said. Someone with a reason to still be there when this is over. She turned that over. It wasn't an answer that asked for anything from her. It didn't claim more than it was. And if it doesn't work, she said, the case against Hale, if it falls apart, then we figure out something else, he said, like it was a given, like the we was already established. She almost said something about that. She held it back. The storm blew itself out sometime before morning. She slept, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake going over everything he had told her, cataloging it, worrying at the details the way she usually worried at things that frightened her. Instead, she slept hard, and without dreams, and woke to the sound of Ronan moving around outside and weak gray light coming through the tent opening and the knowledge that there was a long day of riding ahead. She got up and began to pack her portion of the camp. He noticed, without remarking on it, that she was useful in the mornings. She noticed, without remarking on it, that he had kept the fire going through the night so she wouldn't wake to cold. The next day brought a different kind of terrain, out of the worst of the high ridge country and into a long valley that ran between two mountain flanks, sheltered enough that the temperature rose several degrees, which on an absolute scale still wasn't warm but felt almost generous after the previous days. The horses moved better. The pack mule, who had been expressing opinions about conditions since day one, settled into a more cooperative rhythm. Mabel's body was registering a comprehensive accounting of the previous 3 days. Her hips ached in a way that suggested the gray mare, and she would need a period of mutual adjustment. Her right shoulder was stiff where she had grabbed for the saddle horn on the ridge. She said none of this because there was nothing useful to say about it, and because Ronan was not the kind of man who asked how she was doing in a way that expected a real answer. That would change. She was beginning to understand him well enough to know that. He was not cold. He was careful. There was a distinction. Cold people had withdrawn from the world and found it sufficient. Careful people had learned to move through the world without putting too much down where it could be taken. She had been the same way for years, she realized. The difference was that on her it had read as resignation. On him it read as containment. She thought about what he had told her around the fire. The 2 other women. One gone, one missing. She thought about Victor Hale's pale eyes doing that slow assessment in the parlor, and she felt something that had been sitting in her chest like cold metal begin, very gradually, to transmute into something else. Not anger, exactly. She had said she wasn't angry, and she had meant it. But there was something underneath the grief and the exhaustion that was starting to have a little more shape, a little more heat. She had never been good at being a victim. It wasn't virtue, she had no particular claim to virtue in this. It was more that she had always found the posture uncomfortable, even when it would have been entirely justified. Something in her resisted lying down in the wound. She thought about the woman she didn't know. Victor's previous arrangement, the one Ronan couldn't locate. She thought, when this is over, someone should find her. She didn't say it yet. She was still cataloging things, still building her understanding of the shape of this situation. But she filed it. By late afternoon on the fourth day, Ronan said, "We're close." The valley had narrowed and the tree cover had grown denser, and the trail they were following was not something she would have found on her own. It was barely visible, more suggested than defined, requiring the kind of reading of landscape that came only from long familiarity. She heard water before she saw anything, a river moving fast somewhere below. Then the trees thinned and she saw it. She had expected a cabin. She had prepared herself very deliberately for roughness, for something her body would manage and her spirit would eventually accommodate. A cabin was survivable. A cabin was not frightening. What she saw was not a cabin. It was a house. Not a grand house. Not the kind she had grown up in, not built for impressing anyone, but a solid, serious structure built into the side of the mountain like it had grown there. Timber and stone, with a wide covered porch facing south, and a barn set back into the side, and wood smoke coming from two chimneys. There was a kitchen garden, frozen now, but laid out with clear intention. There was a well with a wooden cover weighted against snow. It was a home that someone had built with care, someone who expected to stay. "This is yours?" she said. "Mine and yours now," he said. Then, after a beat, "If you want it." She looked at it for a long moment, the solid lines of it. The way it sat in this landscape, not like something imposed upon it, but like something that understood where it was. She thought about the wardrobe full of dresses she had left in Denver. She thought about the parlor with the worn rug her parents had argued about. She thought about the long corridor of years in which she had been too large and too different and too something for every space she had been asked to occupy. "It's real," she said. She didn't mean the house exactly. "Yes," he said, like he knew what she meant. They rode down toward the lights. She was still frightened. She wanted to be honest about that, at least inside her own head. She was still frightened, and she didn't trust everything yet, and there were weeks and months ahead of her that were entirely unwritten, and she was riding toward them on a horse that wasn't hers, toward a house that wasn't yet hers either, with a man she had known for 4 days. But she was also, underneath the fear, in a way she hadn't expected to find room for, something that felt like the very beginning of interest. Not in the romantic sense. Not yet, not in the least. But in the sense that she had looked at the shape of this situation, the evidence, the legal maneuvering, the web of Victor Hale's damage, and found it something she could actually sink her teeth into. There was a wrong being done. The scale of it was larger than she had understood in the parlor, and there were women she didn't know yet who had been taken into it, and at least one of them might still be findable. She was here now. She had her mind, which was considerable, and she had time, which the mountains provided in quantity, and she had access to the documents Ronan had mentioned that she hadn't yet seen. The house grew larger as they approached it. She sat up a little straighter on the gray mare. She was not who anyone had expected her to be. That was nothing new. The difference was that now, for the first time, she was beginning to think that might be exactly what this situation required. The house was warmer than she expected. That was the first thing she noticed when Ronan pushed open the front door and stood back to let her through. Not the layout, not the furniture, not the evidence of how a man lived alone in the mountains for years. The warmth. It hit her like something physical after 4 days of cold that had gotten into her bones and settled there like a tenant. She stood just inside the door for a moment and let herself feel it. There was a large fireplace on the north wall that had been banked before they left, still producing steady heat. The floors were wide plank timber, worn smooth. The main room was open, kitchen at one end, a table in the middle large enough for several people, chairs near the fire. There were shelves of tools and supplies along one wall, organized with the particular neatness of a person who lived alone and had learned that disorder in a remote location was not just inconvenient, but dangerous. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something she couldn't identify, something mineral and clean that she would later understand was simply the smell of the mountain itself, coming through the walls and the floor. Ronan set her trunk down near the stairs without ceremony. "Room at the top of the stairs is yours," he said. "There's water heating on the stove. I set it before we left. Should still be warm enough." She turned to look at him. "You set water to heat before a 4-day trip. Figured you'd want it when you got here." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He nodded and began unpacking the gear they had brought in from the horses, moving around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone returning to a space that knew him. She watched him for a moment, the ease of it, the absence of performance, and then she took her coat off and went upstairs. The room was small and honest. A bed with a heavy quilt, a washstand, a window that faced east. There were pegs on the wall for hanging things, a small braided rug on the floor that someone had made by hand, the pattern uneven in a way that suggested patience rather than skill. She stood at the window and looked out at the mountain in the last of the evening light, vast and indifferent, and she was beginning to understand, not hostile in the way she had feared, just large, just itself. She washed her face and hands with the warm water Ronan had left, which was almost exactly warm enough, and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself 5 minutes to feel the full weight of where she was and how she had gotten here. Then she went back downstairs and asked what needed doing. The first week was a process of learning everything she didn't know, which was most things. She was not incompetent. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She could cook, and she could sew, and she could manage a household. These were not small skills. But frontier living operated on a different logic than domestic city life, and the gap between what she knew and what she needed to know was significant and humbling. Ronan was not a patient teacher in the conventional sense. He didn't explain things twice, and he didn't soften observations when she did something wrong. But he also didn't make her feel stupid. The distinction was subtle and important. He spoke to her the way he might speak to someone learning a trade, direct, practical, without condescension, but also without cushioning. When she made a mistake building the fire, he showed her the correct approach once and expected her to apply it. When she misjudged the weight of the water buckets and spilled half of one coming up from the well, he handed her a dry cloth without comment. She found she preferred this to being managed. She had spent a significant portion of her life being managed by people who thought she needed protecting from accurate information. The plain exchange of this place, the directness of the work, and the straightforwardness of Ronan's manner was tiring in the physical sense and clarifying in every other. She asked questions when she had them. He answered them. If he didn't know, he said so. On the 5th day, she asked him about the documents. She had been thinking about them since the fireside conversation during the blizzard. The evidence he had gathered against Victor Hale, the proof of what he had done to her father and presumably to the others. She had been patient about it because she had understood that there was a sequence to earning access to information, and rushing the sequence was a way of getting incomplete versions of things. But a week felt like enough patience. She brought it up at the table after the evening meal, while Ronan was working through some maintenance on a piece of tack that had taken damage during the journey. "The documents," she said. "I want to see them." He looked up from the harness. "The ones you used to purchase the debt," she said, "and whatever else you have on Hale. You told me there was more." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he set the harness down, pushed back from the table, and went to the back of the house. She heard the sound of something moving. A heavy piece of furniture, she thought, and then a silence, and then his footsteps returning. He came back with a wooden box, the kind used for tools, banded with iron at the corners. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside was not a chaos of papers, but an organized system. Folders, each labeled in a tight, economical hand. Letters bound with twine. Official documents with seals on them that she recognized from her father's business dealings. Territorial court documentation, property registry certificates, notarized affidavits. She pulled the first folder toward her and opened it. The next 2 hours were among the more illuminating of her life. Victor Hale had been operating his scheme with a precision that was, she had to admit to herself, almost impressive in its architecture. He had identified the mechanism: federal land contracts that were real, attached to railroad expansion that was real, and had built an elaborate parallel structure around that legitimate core that siphoned the profits while ensuring the documented risk landed elsewhere. The men he chose as partners were not foolish men. They were men with enough reputation and real capital to make the investments credible, and enough trust in working relationships to not scrutinize the fine details of Victor's specific contractual language. The fraud was in the language. It was always in the language. Mabel read carefully. She had a good legal mind that had never been formally developed because no one had suggested that was something a woman of her class and circumstances should develop. She had read her father's contracts with him since she was 16, helping him parse the terms, flagging things that seemed unclear. He had treated it as a kind of game between them. She had treated it as the only intellectually serious work available to her. She understood what she was reading. He altered the indemnification clauses, she said, not looking up. Ronan had settled back into the chair across from her with his coffee, watching her read. Yes. These contracts look identical to the original filings, but the liability language is reversed. If the project fails, the risk flows to the junior partners, your father and the others, and Hale's position is classified as a senior secured creditor. She looked up. He filed 2 versions, the version everyone signed and the version that was submitted to the territorial registry. Yes, Ronan said again. How did you get the registered version? Took time, he said, and someone inside the territory office who understood what he was looking at. Is that person safe? The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, not that she could ask it, but that it was the question she went to first. Yes, he said after a beat. He's been moved to another county. She looked back at the papers. Hale knows you have this. He suspects. He doesn't know the full extent. But he knows enough to be concerned. She thought about the pale eyes in the parlor, the very thin composure after Ronan had put the debt documents on the table. He'll move to discredit the source, or to get these copies before you can have them authenticated by someone with authority to act on them. That's the problem, Ronan said. He leaned forward slightly. The territorial judge in Denver, Judge Calloway. He's not dirty, but he's cautious. He's been approached twice with preliminary information about Hale, and both times he's found reasons to wait. More documentation needed, more verification. There's always something. His jaw tightened. Hale has cultivated enough goodwill in that city that moving against him requires a case so thorough there's no room for a cautious man to find a reason to set it aside. What's missing? Testimony, he said. Documentation is one thing. A person who was directly in the mechanism and can speak to what they experienced, that's different. He paused. One of Victor's previous partners left the state rather than pursue it. He's afraid, and I understand it, but he's gone. The other woman, Mabel said. He nodded. Margaret Ferris married Victor in 1878. Her family's mining concern was the target. I have documentation of her marriage, documentation of the asset transfer, but I haven't been able to locate her. He looked at the fire. Victor told people she left him. He was very sympathetic about it. Everyone believed him because… He stopped. Because she was a woman and leaving seemed plausible, Mabel finished. Yes. She sat quietly with this for a moment. Margaret Ferris. A name. A missing person constructed into a story of departure that no one had questioned. I'll find her, Mabel said. Ronan looked at her. Not immediately, she said. I'm not saying I'll walk out into the mountains tomorrow, but correspondence can cover ground that geography can't, and I have connections in Denver through my family's social circles that you don't have. Women talk to each other about things they don't say in front of men. If Margaret Ferris is findable, I can find her. He held her gaze for a long moment. You've been here a week, he said. I'm aware of that. I wasn't… He stopped, recalibrated. I wasn't suggesting you haven't earned the right to be involved. I was noting that you haven't had time to settle. I settled on the ride up here, she said. I've been ready since before we reached the ridge. Something shifted in his face. Small movement, difficult to name. She thought it might be the closest he came, habitually, to something like admiration. All right, he said. She pulled the folder with Margaret Ferris's name on it toward her and began to read. The weeks that followed established a pattern that neither of them had discussed or planned, which Mabel suspected was why it worked. Ronan managed the external operation of the property, the livestock, the timber cutting he did on contract for a mill operation 2 valleys over, the trapping lines he ran in the upper country. He was gone several hours a day, and sometimes overnight when weather or distance required it. He had a neighboring property, a man named Asa Croft, who ran cattle on the lower slopes, and they had an established understanding of mutual assistance. the kind of unspoken social contract that seemed to govern relationships in the high country more honestly than any formal arrangement. Mabel managed the house, which was work enough, but the house was not all she managed. She wrote letters. She wrote them carefully, in language that said precisely what she intended and nothing that could be used against her, to women she had known in Denver's social world. Women who moved in the circles that Victor Hale also moved in. Women who attended the same dinners and the same charitable events, and who noticed things that the men around them assumed they did not notice. She was subtle about it. She was not asking direct questions about Victor Hale, which would have been both obvious and dangerous. She was maintaining correspondence. She was a woman who had recently married and relocated, which was entirely unremarkable. And she was writing to her former social connections in the way that relocated women did. She mentioned Victor only in passing, casually, in the context of Denver society news, in ways designed to invite information rather than demand it. She was also reading everything in the wooden box. It took 3 weeks to go through it thoroughly. Some of it she had to read twice or 3 times until the full architecture of what Victor had constructed became clear in her head. She made notes, organized, cross-referenced, structured in a way that made the connections between documents visible in a way that they weren't when the folders were read separately. When she showed her notes to Ronan, he sat with them for a long time. "You can see it here," she said, pointing to a specific notation. "The timing of the registry filing and the timing of the original signature are 5 weeks apart. That's the window." He had the signed contracts in 5 weeks during which he had access to the registry office before the partnership was formally activated. Whatever he changed in that window. She looked at him. "Is there a way to get the date stamps on the registry submissions independently verified?" Ronan looked at her notes and then at her. "Possibly," he said. "There's a federal land officer in Santa Fe who's been looking at railroad contract irregularities for a different case. Might be willing to look at this." "Write to him," Mabel said. "I was planning to." "Write to him this week. Don't wait for the Ferris situation to develop. Build the documentary case and the witness case in parallel. If one takes longer, the other might be ready." She paused. "That's what Victor does. He runs parallel structures. Use the same approach." Ronan put down her notes. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked with the same directness he gave everything. "My father's contracts," she said. "Since I was 16. He treated it like a game. I treated it like the only serious work anyone was going to let me do." She picked up her notes again. "Turns out it wasn't a game." He looked at her for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then he said, "I'll write to Santa Fe tomorrow." The hardest part of those weeks was not the work, and not the cold, and not the adjustments required by living in close proximity to a person she was still in the process of learning. The hardest part was the absence of news about Margaret Ferris. Mabel had sent careful letters to 4 women and had received careful letters back, and none of them had contained what she was looking for. 3 of the women had no information. The 4th, a woman named Clara Beecham, who had been a peripheral acquaintance of Victor's social circle, had written back something that seemed on the surface like nothing but which Mabel read 3 times and found deeply interesting. Clara had written in the middle of a long paragraph about Denver social news. "It is strange, isn't it, how Victor Hale's acquaintances seem to scatter so thoroughly. I mentioned his name to Dorothea Price last week, and she went quite pale, though she wouldn't say why, and changed the subject so quickly I nearly got a headache from watching her pivot." Dorothea Price. Mabel wrote the name down and looked at it. She went back through everything she knew about Denver's social geography and placed Dorothea Price carefully. A widow. Originally from Kansas. She had come to Denver approximately 4 years ago, which put her arrival at 1877. Which was 1 year before Victor Hale's marriage to Margaret Ferris. She moved on the edges of several social circles without being firmly planted in anyone. She was described by people who mentioned her as quiet, a little withdrawn, not unkind. Mabel wrote to Clara Beecham again. And she asked, very casually, in a paragraph about other things, whether Clara knew anything about Dorothea Price's background before Denver. Then she waited. The waiting was the part she was worst at. She managed it by working harder. Ronan had begun, without formal discussion, to include her in aspects of the property operation that he might not have otherwise. Not because he needed the help exactly, but because she had made clear that she was available for it, and he had taken her at her word. She helped him with the timber assessments, learned to read the marking system he used to identify which trees were ready for cutting and which needed another season. She went with him twice to meet Asa Croft, who was a weathered, spare man of about 60, who had initially looked at her with the careful blankness of someone reserving judgment, and who by the second visit had clearly adjusted his position, because he directed most of his conversation to her and offered her coffee before he offered it to Ronan. She was also learning to handle a firearm. This had been her request, not Ronan's suggestion. She had asked directly one morning while he was cleaning his rifle at the table. "I want you to teach me to use that," she said. He looked up. "Not necessarily that specific gun," she said. "Whatever is appropriate. But I want to know how." "Any particular reason?" he asked. Not challenging, just asking. "Several," she said. "Practical ones." He nodded and began to show her how the rifle was disassembled. She was not a natural shot. This was not false modesty. Her first several sessions were genuinely poor, and she accepted this with the same even temperament she tried to bring to everything she was learning here. The skill required a coordination between breath and stillness and the management of anticipation that took time to develop, and she was willing to take the time. By the fourth week, she was hitting her targets with enough consistency to satisfy her own standard, if not yet to impress anyone. Ronan said, after one session, "You correct faster than most people." "Is that a compliment?" "Observation," he said. She decided to accept it as both. It was during the fifth week that the first letter came from Clara Beecham that contained something useful. Clara had, with the social investigative instincts of a woman who had spent 20 years navigating complicated circles, done some careful asking. Dorothea Price, it emerged, had not always been Dorothea Price. She had come to Denver under that name, a widow's name, but there were people who had known her longer and who knew that she had been briefly married before her widowhood, a marriage that had ended not in her husband's death, but in some circumstance that no one had been willing to be specific about. Her name before Denver, Clara had managed to discover through a connection in Kansas, had been Dorothea Ferris. Mabel sat very still at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands. Margaret Ferris. Dorothea Ferris. She put the letter down and went to the wooden box and opened the Ferris folder again. Margaret Ferris, married Victor Hale in 1878. Her family, a father and a brother, both involved in the mining concern that Victor had targeted. The father had died in 1879. Listed cause, illness. The brother had left Colorado entirely. A sister. The folder had no mention of a sister because Ronan had been looking for Margaret, not for her family constellation. But a woman who knew what her sister's marriage to Victor Hale had actually been would have very specific reasons to be pale at the mention of his name. And she was in Denver. Mabel took out paper and began to write. Not to Clara this time. To Dorothea Price directly. She wrote carefully, choosing every word the way she would choose footing on an icy trail, certain of each placement before she transferred her weight. She said nothing explicit. She said that she was writing on a matter of some delicacy, that she had come to understand they might have certain experiences in common, and that she would welcome the opportunity to correspond further if Dorothea was willing. She gave Ronan's name and the general location, far enough from specifics to be safe, and she signed it with her married name, Mabel Blackwood. She looked at the name for a moment before folding the letter. It was still strange on paper, that name. She had not spent much time thinking about it. There had been too many other things to think about. She sealed the letter and set it with the others going out with Asa Croft on his next supply run to the valley town. When Ronan came in from the timber work that evening, she told him what she had found. He stood at the table and read Clara's letter and then looked at her notes and then looked at her. "Dorothea Price," he said. "Margaret Ferris's sister. I'm certain enough to act on it. If Victor finds out we've contacted her—" "I know," Mabel said. "The letter is careful. Clara Beecham doesn't know what she was helping me find, so she can't inadvertently expose it. And Dorothea has her own reasons to be careful about Victor Hale." She paused. "She's been hiding in plain sight in Denver for 4 years. She knows how to be careful." Ronan sat down slowly. He picked up her notes and read through them again, more slowly this time. "You cross-referenced the date stamps," he said. "That's what breaks the case open," she said. "Not the altered contracts alone, so..." Those could be explained away by a skilled enough lawyer as clerical error. But the date stamp discrepancy, combined with testimony from someone inside the family affected by the Ferris marriage, combined with the Santa Fe Federal Irregularities investigation, that's a case that a cautious judge can't set aside. She sat down across from him. We need to know what happened to Margaret Ferris. If she's alive, her testimony is irreplaceable. If she's not, Mabel stopped. If she's not, that's a different charge. The room was quiet. The fire moved. I hadn't let myself say that, Ronan said. His voice was even, but she could hear what it cost him. I know, she said. I've been telling myself she left, that she got out somehow, the way the other one did. She might have, Mabel said. I'm not concluding anything. I'm saying Dorothea Price may be the person who knows. He set the notes down. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and she could see him working through something. Not grief exactly, because she thought the grief had been present for some time, managed and stored in the way he stored everything. More like permission to acknowledge what he had been trying not to acknowledge. Who is she to you? Mabel asked. He looked up. Margaret Ferris, Mabel said. You said Victor's operation damaged someone you cared about. I've assumed it was a business associate. But you've been looking for Margaret Ferris specifically for 2 years, and it's in your face right now in a way it isn't when you talk about my father's case or the other partner. He was quiet for a long time. She was my cousin, he said finally. We grew up in the same county. She trusted people more than she should have. She always did. I was away when Hale came around. By the time I understood what was happening, she was already married. Mabel absorbed this. And you've been building this case since she disappeared, she said. Yes. She looked at his hands on the table, the scar on his jaw, the years of it, 2 years of gathering documents and cultivating sources and watching and waiting while a man walked around Denver being respected. We're going to find her, she said. She said it the same way he had said, I've got you, on the ridge. Not as a promise she could guarantee, but as a statement of direction. This is where we're pointed. This is what we're doing. He looked at her across the table. She had been here 5 weeks. 5 weeks since the Denver parlor and the debt documents and the 3-day ride into the high country. 5 weeks of work and cold and correspondence and learning to read the timber lines and shoot the rifle and understand the way the mountain changed its character between morning and afternoon. She was not who she had been in that parlor. She was still herself. She had always been herself. That was the thing no one had understood. But the version of herself that had been folded and compressed into the space that city life had allotted her was slowly unfolding here into something that fit more accurately what she had always been. She was not happy, exactly. She was too alert for happiness, too aware of what was unresolved. But she was more herself than she had been in years, possibly than she had ever been. And there was something in that which was not yet named but was growing. Outside, the mountain sat in the dark. The fire burned low. Ronan picked up her notes again, and she pulled the Ferris folder toward her, and they worked at the table together until the candles burned to stubs, and the cold had crept back into the corners of the room. In the morning, Asa Croft would take the letters down to the valley. One of them was addressed to Dorothea Price in Denver. Whatever came back in response would either confirm what Mabel believed, or it would close a door that no one wanted to look behind. She was going to look anyway. That much had never been in question. Dorothea Price's letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Mabel had sent hers. Asa Croft brought it up with the monthly supplies, tucked between a catalog from a seed merchant and a folded newspaper from Denver that was already 2 weeks old. He handed the bundle to Mabel without comment, the way he handled most things, and she took it inside and stood at the kitchen table and looked at the envelope for a long moment before she opened it. The handwriting was very controlled. Too controlled. The kind of penmanship that came not from confidence but from the effort of a person who had learned to keep their hand steady under circumstances that would have made most hands shake. She read it twice before she called for Ronan. Dorothea had not confirmed anything directly. The letter was careful in the same way Mabel's had been careful, operating in the register of social correspondence while carrying a different weight underneath. But the things she had written, and more importantly the things she had written around, told Mabel what she needed to know. She knew about Victor. She knew things that a woman who had only watched from the outside would not know. She wrote about Denver's social season and a recent concert at the Opera House, and the state of certain mutual acquaintances, And in the middle of all of it, one sentence. I find myself thinking often of people who have left situations that were not good for them, and I am always glad to hear they are managing well in their new circumstances. It was not evidence, it was not testimony, but it was a door opened 1 inch by someone who was deciding whether to open it further. Ronan read it standing at the table, still in his work coat, and when he finished, he set it down and was quiet. She knows, Mabel said. Yes. She's deciding whether to trust us. Yes. He looked at the letter again. She's been deciding that for 4 years. Whatever Victor did, or whatever she knows about what Victor did, she's been carrying it alone. I'll write back, Mabel said. I need to give her something real. Not everything, but enough to show her we're not another mechanism. That's a risk. She's already a risk, Mabel said. If she decides not to help, she could go to Victor. She could tell him we're building a case. She looked at him steadily. But I don't think she will. I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Ronan considered this. What are you going to tell her? The truth, Mabel said. Enough of it. She wrote the second letter that evening. She told Dorothea plainly that she had married a man named Ronan Blackwood following a debt arrangement that Victor Hale had constructed for her family. She described the documents in general terms, enough to demonstrate that she was not guessing at the shape of what Victor had done, that she understood its architecture. She said that Ronan had been looking for Margaret Ferris for 2 years, and that he was her cousin, and that they did not know whether Margaret was alive or what had happened to her, and that the answer to that question mattered to more than one person and for more than one reason. She did not ask Dorothea to testify. She did not make demands. She said only that she was asking Dorothea to tell them what she knew, if she was willing, and that whatever she said would be handled with care. She sealed the letter and gave it to Asa on Thursday. Then she waited again, which was still the part she was worst at. The mountain did not particularly care about her waiting. March arrived with a thaw that lasted 4 days and then reversed into a cold snap that was, according to Ronan, not unusual, but also not pleasant. The timber work continued. The correspondence with the federal land officer in Santa Fe had produced something useful. An acknowledgement that the date stamp irregularities Mabel had identified were consistent with a pattern the Santa Fe office had been examining in 3 other cases, and an indication that the officer, a man named Caldwell, was willing to include the Whitmore documentation in a broader federal review. That was significant. A territorial judge could be cautious. A federal review was harder to set aside. She told Ronan the night Caldwell's letter arrived. He was at the table sharpening a blade, the way he often spent evenings, occupied with something physical while his mind ran. He read the letter and set it down and didn't say much, but she could read him well enough by then to know that the set of his shoulders had changed. That's the second piece, she said. The date stamps, the federal review. If Dorothea gives us anything about Margaret, it's enough, Ronan said. With those 3 things, it's enough to compel Calloway. It's enough to compel a braver judge than Calloway, she said. He looked at her. I've been reading about the circuit court system, she said. If Calloway continues to be cautious, there are mechanisms for bringing a case at the circuit level rather than the territorial level. It takes longer, but it removes the local influence. She paused. Victor Hale has spent years cultivating Denver. He hasn't spent the same energy on the federal circuit. You've been reading about the circuit court system, Ronan repeated. Asa brought a legal almanac in the last supply run. I found it useful. He looked at her for another moment with the expression she had come to recognize. Not quite surprise, not quite amusement, something that lived between the two and was specific to her. I'll write to a lawyer I know in Cheyenne, he said. He has circuit experience. Good, she said. What she did not tell him, because she was not ready to talk about it yet, was that the waiting for Dorothea's response was affecting her more than she wanted to admit. Not because she doubted her analysis. She was fairly certain she was right about Dorothea. What was keeping her awake some nights was the other possibility. Margaret Ferris, missing for 4 years. The specific texture of what Ronan was carrying, which she understood better now than she had at the fireside during the blizzard. She thought about her own situation as a point of comparison, which she found clarifying even when it was uncomfortable. She had been in Denver with a collapsing family fortune and a man like Victor presenting himself as the only available solution. She had been lucky. And it was luck, she was honest about that. Lucky that Ronan had moved first. Lucky that there had been a Ronan at all. Margaret Ferris had not had a Ronan. Whatever had happened to Margaret Ferris had happened to a woman in the same position, without anyone intervening in time. She felt that knowledge sitting in her chest at 2 in the morning when the mountain was completely silent and the cold had its full weight, and she lay in the room with the east-facing window thinking about a woman she had never met. Dorothea's second letter arrived 5 weeks after the first. It was longer. The handwriting was still controlled, but the control had a different quality to it. Less like someone holding their hand steady, and more like someone who had made a decision and was moving forward with it. She told them about Margaret. Not everything in one letter. Mabel understood that this would come in pieces, and that was all right. But she told them the essential things. Margaret Ferris had not left Victor Hale voluntarily. She had attempted to leave in the autumn of 1879, approximately 14 months after the marriage, when the full reality of what Victor was had become impossible to misread. Victor had prevented it. Dorothea was not explicit about the means, writing only that her sister had been made to understand that leaving was not a choice available to her, which was language that Mabel read with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the mountain temperature. In the spring of 1880, a woman who matched Margaret's description had been seen boarding a westbound train in Colorado Springs, traveling alone. No documentation existed under her name. Whether she had used a false name, whether the woman was actually Margaret, whether she had reached wherever she was going, Dorothea did not know. What Dorothea did know, because she had been in contact with Victor's household during the period of the marriage, was that the last 6 months of Margaret's time in that house had involved circumstances that were not described in any public accounting of Victor Hale's first marriage, and that she would be willing to provide a written statement about what she had observed if it would help bring those circumstances to a court's attention. She would not come to Denver to testify. She did not say why, and Mabel did not need her to. But a written statement, properly notarized, was something. Mabel read the letter at the table and then passed it to Ronan without speaking. She watched him read it. She watched his face do the things his face did when he was processing something that was costing him. The stillness that was not calm, the way his jaw moved slightly without any words coming out. He read it all the way through, and then he set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. "She's alive," he said. His voice was flat in the way things went flat when feeling was present but not expressible. "Probably," Mabel said. "The description matches and the timing fits. She got out. She's been out there for 3 years with no—" He stopped. "I looked. I sent letters. I asked people." "She changed her name," Mabel said. "She didn't want to be found. That's not a criticism of your search." She paused. "She may not want to be found now. We have to accept that." He was quiet. "But Dorothea's statement is what we needed," Mabel said. "Combined with the federal documentation, it establishes a pattern of behavior that goes beyond financial fraud, that changes the nature of the case, that changes what Victor Hale is charged with." Ronan looked at her. Something in his face had shifted. Not resolved, not healed, but reoriented. He was a man who operated by having something to do, she had come to understand. Give him action, and he moved through grief. Take the action away, and the grief sat. She was giving him action. "I want to bring the full package to the Cheyenne lawyer," she said. "All of it. The date stamp analysis, the Caldwell correspondence, Dorothea's statement when it arrives in writing. I want a legal opinion on the strongest submission path, and I want it before Victor makes another move." "Victor's not patient," Ronan said. "We've been up here 3 months. He doesn't know what we have, but he knows we have something." "How do you know that?" "Because he sent someone to talk to Asacroft last month," Ronan said. She stared at him. "Someone came to the lower property asking questions about who was living up here and what their business was. Asa told me yesterday. He said he didn't think it was worth mentioning sooner because the man left without learning anything useful." "It's absolutely worth mentioning sooner," Mabel said. The edge in her voice was sharper than she usually let things get. "Ronan, if Victor is already sending people to ask questions, we don't have as much time as I thought." "I know," he said. "I should have told you when Asa told me. I was—" He stopped. "What?" "Trying to figure out how to handle it without worrying you," he said, and she could hear, underneath the admission, that he knew how it sounded. She looked at him directly. "Don't do that," she said. "I'm not here to be managed. I'm here to help you build this case, and I can't do that if you're deciding what I should and shouldn't know." He held her gaze and didn't look away from it. "You're right," he said, "not as capitulation, as acknowledgement. What else hasn't been worth mentioning?" A pause. "A week ago, a rider came up the eastern approach. Not the main trail, the one through the back timber. I tracked him for a few hours. He turned around before he reached the property line. Scouting," she said. "That was my read. Then we have days, not weeks." She pushed back from the table and stood. "We need to move the documents." "Move them where?" "Not here," she said. "The originals need to be somewhere Victor's men can't find them. Asa's property? Can he be trusted with that?" "With his life," Ronan said. "Then we make copies. We've already got my notes and the cross-referenced analysis. And we send the originals to Asa tonight. Tomorrow I'll start on a clean copy of everything for the Cheyenne lawyer, one complete package that can be sent immediately if something happens here." Ronan was already moving. He went to the wooden box and began pulling folders. They worked through that night, side by side at the table, organizing and copying by candlelight. Mabel wrote quickly but legibly, her handwriting less elegant than Dorothea's careful script, but more efficient, prioritizing clarity over appearance. Ronan sorted and collated. Between them on the table, the architecture of Victor Hale's fraud and its human damage was laid out in a sequence that any competent reader could follow. Around midnight, Ronan put a cup of coffee next to her hand without interrupting her writing. She drank it without looking up. Around 2 in the morning, she reached the section of her notes dealing with the indemnification clause alterations, and she caught something she hadn't caught before, a cross-reference between one of Victor's property filings and a name in an earlier document that she had not connected until she saw them on adjacent pages of her own organized copy. She stopped writing. "Ronan," she said. He looked up. "This name here." She pointed. "Eldon Marsh. He appears in the property registry as a witness on the original contracts. He's a notary. He witnesses a lot of documents. He witnesses the original contracts, and he also appears here." She pulled another page from the stack. "As a listed employee of Hale's private business office. That's not a notary functioning independently. That's Victor's own employee notarizing documents and presenting them as independent witnesses." Ronan came around to her side of the table and looked at where she was pointing. "Eldon Marsh," he said slowly. "If we can get Marsh's employment records from Hale's business office, even just an affidavit from anyone who knew he worked for Victor during this period, it invalidates the notarization. Without valid notarization, the entire registered submission is legally defective." She looked at him. "Victor's contracts are void." Ronan straightened up. She could see him running it through, checking the logic. "Marsh is still in Denver," he said. "I know him slightly. He's not a brave man." "Victor isn't kind to people who fail him," Mabel said. "If Marsh understands that his own legal exposure increases the longer Victor's scheme remains intact, if he understands that cooperating with a federal investigation offers him a path out, that continuing to be loyal to Victor does not, he might talk to Caldwell in Santa Fe. Victor will protect him as long as he's useful. Victor will protect him until the moment he becomes a liability," Mabel said. "That's how Victor works. Marsh probably knows that. Fear can cut both ways." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "You've built more of this case in 3 months than I built in 2 years, he said. She considered this. "You were building the foundation," she said. "I'm building on top of it. Neither one works without the other." He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back, and there was something between them in the candlelight in the middle of that working night that was not named and was not ready to be named, but was present in the room the way warmth was present. Not visible exactly, but felt. She looked back at her papers. "We should finish this," she said. "Yes," he said, and went back to his side of the table. By 4 in the morning, 2 complete copies of everything existed. One set, including all originals, went with Ronan at first light to Asa Croft's property, wrapped in oilskin and placed in Asa's root cellar under a false floor that Asa had built for storing valuables during hard winters. The second set went into a separate packet addressed to the Cheyenne lawyer, ready to send. Mabel slept 3 hours and woke feeling like she had been assembled incorrectly, various parts of her protesting at different volumes. She made breakfast and ate it standing at the window, looking at the eastern approach through the trees, thinking about a rider she had never seen who had turned around before reaching the property line. He would not turn around next time. She knew that in the particular way she had come to know things in this mountain winter. Not from experience exactly, but from the accumulating logic of the situation. Victor Hale was not patient, Ronan had said. 3 months was already longer than a man like Victor would tolerate uncertainty. She was thinking this, standing at the window with her cup, when she saw the horse, not on the eastern approach, on the main trail, coming down from the north, which was wrong, because there was nothing to the north of them that would send a rider this direction in early morning. The rider was moving quickly, not with the casual pace of a neighbor or a supply delivery. She set her cup down and went to the door. Ronan was not back from Asa's yet. He had said 2 hours, and it had been close to 3. She went to the shelf where the rifle was kept and took it down. The rider was a young man, maybe 20, and he pulled up hard when he saw her standing on the porch with the rifle held in the ready position, not aimed, but present. "Ma'am," he raised one hand. I've got a message for Ronan Blackwood." "He's not here," she said. "I'm his wife. Give me the message." The young man hesitated. "Give me the message," she said again, and something in her voice must have communicated that hesitating was not his best option. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper and leaned down from the horse to offer it. She came off the porch and took it and stepped back. She read it while he waited. It was from Asa Croft. Asa's handwriting, distinctive and spare. 3 men came to my lower property asking about the Blackwood place. Armed. I told them I don't know your business. They went north on the Ridge Trail an hour ago. Get ready." She looked up at the young man, who was Asa's hired hand, she understood now, sent ahead. "How far behind them is my husband?" she said. "Not far, ma'am. He was coming down my boss's drive when I left." "Go back and stay with Asa," she said. "Lock the door." He turned his horse and went. She went inside and loaded the rifle fully and checked the pistol that Ronan kept in the drawer beside the door and put it in her apron pocket and stood in the main room and thought for 10 seconds about what she was doing. She had been learning to shoot for 3 months. She was not expert, but she was not helpless either, and what she knew was that 3 armed men coming to a property where they expected to find documents and a woman alone was a specific kind of problem, and her options were to hide and hope or to be prepared and present. She was not built for hoping. She went to the window and watched the northern approach. They came 20 minutes later, 3 men on horses, coming out of the timberline at a pace that said they weren't worried about being watched. They hadn't expected her to be at the window. They hadn't expected the rifle. She let them come to the edge of the yard before she opened the door. "This is private property," she said. Her voice was level. This surprised her, somewhere underneath the fear that was absolutely present and that she was not pretending wasn't there. "State your business." The man in front, older, with a deliberate kind of face, looked at her and then at the rifle and then back at her. He was recalibrating. They had expected to arrive at an empty house or a frightened woman. They were getting neither. "We have business with Ronan Blackwood," he said. "He's not here," she said. "And you didn't ride 4 hours into the mountains for a social call, so tell me the real business or get off this property." The man on the left shifted his horse sideways, which was a flanking movement, and she moved the rifle to track him before she fully decided to do it. "I wouldn't," she said. He stopped. The man in front looked at her with the particular expression of someone revising his assessment of the situation. "We're looking for papers," he said, "documents that belong to our employer." "They don't," she said, "but I'll tell you what those papers prove they don't, if you want to have that conversation." The third man, she had been tracking him in her peripheral vision, the one who had been quiet since they arrived, moved his hand toward his coat. She heard Ronan before she saw him. He came out of the timber to the east, on foot because he had left the horse somewhere back in the trees, and he was moving fast, and he had his own rifle, and he came around the side of the property, and the geometry of the situation changed immediately. 3 armed men, but now there were 2 defenders on opposite sides of them. The man who had moved his hand toward his coat stopped moving it. The silence lasted several seconds. "Those papers are in federal hands," Ronan said. He was breathing hard from moving quickly through the timber, but his voice was steady. "Not here. Not anywhere you can reach. You can tell your employer that." The man in front looked at Ronan and then at Mabel and then back at Ronan. "He'll want confirmation," the man said. "He'll get it," Ronan said, "from the Federal Circuit Office in Cheyenne when they contact him as part of their investigation. That's the only confirmation he's getting." Another silence. Mabel's arms were tired. She had been holding the rifle at ready position for longer than she had held it at any point during training, and her shoulders were registering it with a specificity that would have been funny in other circumstances. She did not lower it. The man in front looked at her once more. Not the assessment Victor Hale had made in the parlor, not inventory, not calculation of what she was worth. This was something simpler, genuine uncertainty about a woman he had not anticipated. She looked back at him without blinking. He turned his horse. The other two followed. She watched them go back the way they had come, into the timber, until she couldn't hear the horses anymore. Then she lowered the rifle and stood on the porch and breathed. Ronan came across the yard. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. "The packet is already with Asa," he said. "I left it and came straight back when I saw his hand writing out." She nodded. "You held them," he said. "They weren't expecting a woman with a rifle," she said. "That bought enough time." "You held them," he said again, differently, not reporting a fact, saying something else. She looked at him standing there in the cold morning light with the timber behind him, and she thought about the ridge with the blizzard and the tent and the candlelit nights at the table, and the moment she had read Dorothea's letter and understood what she was holding. She thought about the list she had made in her head in the Denver parlor, the practical list, the only thing she had known how to do when the world was dissolving. She had come a considerable distance from that list. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee. Make coffee, and we need to write to Cheyenne today. Not tomorrow. Today." He came up the steps. He stopped beside her at the door and looked at her for a moment, close enough that she could see the cold air on his face and the particular quality of his steadiness, which she had come to understand was not the steadiness of a person who felt nothing but the steadiness of a person who had learned to stand very still while feeling a great deal. "Mabel," he said. She looked at him. He seemed to decide something. "Thank you," he said. It was not a small thing, the way he said it. It had the weight of all the months in it. "We're not done yet," she said. "No," he said, "but thank you anyway." She went inside. After a moment, he followed. The coffee was cold. She heated it, and they sat at the table with the second copy of the documents between them and began to write the letter to Cheyenne. And outside the mountain sat enormous and indifferent in the late morning sun. And Victor Hale was somewhere in Denver believing he still had time, not yet knowing that the thing he had set in motion 3 months ago in a parlor with a debt document and a cruel proposal had become something that was no longer moving in his direction. The writer they had sent had turned around, and this time he hadn't been scouting. This time he had gone back to report that it was already too late. The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Thursday in late April, when the snow on the lower slopes had finally begun its retreat and the mud season had arrived to replace it with a different kind of difficulty. Mabel was in the kitchen garden when Asa's hand brought it up. She had been working the soil in the beds closest to the house, turning it over with a fork, learning its character the way she had been learning everything about this place, by putting her hands in it and paying attention. The ground up here was different from anything she had known. Rocky underneath, richer on top than you would expect, with a particular resistance that rewarded persistence rather than force. She stripped her gloves off and took the letter. The lawyer's name was Edmund Carver, and he wrote with the precision of a man who had learned that words had legal weight and treated them accordingly. She read it standing in the kitchen garden with mud on her boots and the smell of turned earth around her, and when she finished, she read it again. Carver had reviewed the complete documentation package. His assessment, delivered in careful legal language that she translated as she read, was unambiguous. The case was strong enough to compel federal action. The Eldon Marsh notarization issue alone was sufficient to invalidate Victor's registered contracts. Combined with the date stamp discrepancy, the Caldwell correspondence from Santa Fe, and Dorothea Price's written statement, which had arrived by post 6 weeks prior, and which Mabel had already forwarded as part of the Cheyenne package, the aggregate constituted what Carver called a pattern of deliberate fraud executed with premeditation across multiple jurisdictions, which moved the matter from territorial civil court directly into federal criminal territory. There was one more thing in the letter. Carver had, through a contact in the federal marshal's office, made preliminary inquiries about a woman named Margaret Ferris, using the description Mabel had included and the approximate timeline of her departure from Colorado Springs in the spring of 1880. A woman matching that description, traveling under the name Ruth Callahan, had settled in a small town in northern Utah. She was alive. She was working as a seamstress. She had not contacted her family because she had believed for 3 years that it was the only way to stay safe. Mabel stood in the garden and held the letter and let herself feel the full weight of that for a moment. Alive. Working as a seamstress in Utah under a name she had chosen for the same reason Mabel had learned to hold a rifle, because the world had given her no better tools for protecting herself. She went inside and found Ronan. He was in the barn doing something to one of the stall doors that had been sticking since the freeze-thaw cycle had swollen the wood. He had a plane in his hand and a look of focused irritation that he reserved for inanimate objects that weren't cooperating. She waited until he looked up. She held out the letter. He read it the way he read everything, completely, without hurrying, without his face telling her much. But she watched his hands on the paper. When he reached the section about Margaret, his hands went very still. He finished reading. He lowered the letter to his side. He turned and looked at the barn wall for a moment, not at anything in particular. Northern Utah, he said. A town called Millhaven, according to Carver's contact. He didn't go further without our authorization. She paused. We can write to her, or you can go. She doesn't know I've been looking. She will when you tell her. He was quiet for another moment. The barn around them was full of the ordinary sounds of animals and settling wood and the distant drip of snowmelt off the eaves. Not a dramatic setting for what was happening inside him. That was how the actual significant moments came. Mabel had been finding, not staged, not lit for effect, but in the middle of ordinary surroundings that didn't adjust themselves to the emotional occasion. She'll be frightened, he said. If someone comes looking for her, even me, she's been hiding for 3 years. She's built something under a different name. I know, Mabel said. Write first. Tell her the case is moving. Tell her she doesn't have to do anything. Dorothea's statement is enough. Carver says it's enough. Tell her she's safe. Tell her... She stopped, looked at him. Tell her you looked for her for 2 years. He turned back from the wall. There was something in his face that she did not have a name for, which was unusual because she had developed a fairly comprehensive understanding of his expressions over these months. It was not quite grief, and not quite relief, and not quite something else. It was all of those things in a proportion that hadn't existed before and would not exist in quite the same way again. I'll write today, he said. I know, she said. I'll help you with it if you want. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. I'd like that. They wrote to Margaret that evening. It took 3 drafts, which was more than either of them usually needed. Mabel because she generally knew what she wanted to say and how to say it. Ronan because he was not a man who struggled with words when he had decided to use them. But this was different. This was a letter to someone who had every reason to distrust the arrival of any letter, and the difference between a version that felt safe and a version that felt like another approach of the type she had been hiding from was subtle and mattered enormously. The final version was short, shorter than either of them expected to end up with. It said that she was alive in people's thoughts and had never been forgotten. It said the case was in federal hands and would proceed without requiring her to participate. It said that if she chose to be in contact, they would receive her, and if she chose to stay where she was under the name she had chosen, they would respect that too. It said that Ronan had been looking for her for 2 years, not to compel her, but because she was family, and that was something she deserved to know, regardless of what she decided. Mabel addressed the envelope. Ronan held it for a moment before letting it go into the outgoing correspondence. The federal process, once it began moving, moved with a speed that Mabel had not entirely anticipated. She had understood, intellectually, that federal mechanisms operated differently than territorial ones, were less susceptible to local social pressure, less influenced by the kind of cultivated goodwill that Victor had spent years building in Denver. But she had expected the usual bureaucratic drag, the requests for additional documentation, the delays. What she had not accounted for was the Eldon Marsh variable. Carver had, independently of anything Mabel had suggested, sent an inquiry to Marsh. The inquiry had been carefully worded. Carver was good at his work. And it had presented Marsh with the same analysis Mabel had made in the kitchen that candlelit night. His exposure, his path, the choice between loyalty to a man who would discard him the moment he became inconvenient and cooperation with a federal investigation that would treat him as a witness rather than a defendant. Marsh had responded within a week. He had not only confirmed his employment in Victor Hale's private business office, during the period of the contract filings. He had provided, from his own files, copies of instructions he had received from Victor regarding the specific language changes in the indemnification clauses. He had kept them, he said, because he was not a stupid man, and he had always understood that insurance against a man like Victor Hale was not a luxury, but a necessity. When Carver forwarded this information to Caldwell in Santa Fe and to the Federal Circuit Court in Cheyenne, the case moved from preliminary review to formal investigation in the same week. Victor Hale was served with federal papers on a Wednesday morning in early May at his Denver office in front of 3 of his business associates. Mabel learned this from Clara Beecham's letter, which arrived with a detail that Clara had clearly found satisfying to report. Victor had read the papers and then set them very carefully on his desk and asked his associates to excuse him, and the performance of composure had been, according to the woman who cleaned his office and who had told Clara everything, imperfect in a way that no performance of Victor's had ever been imperfect before. His hands had shaken. Mabel read that detail twice and felt something settle in her chest that had been braced for a long time. The legal proceedings that followed were not quick. That was the truth of it, and she wanted to be honest about that truth rather than smooth it into something more satisfying. Federal cases in 1881 moved at the pace of correspondence and circuit schedules and the availability of judges who covered enormous geographic territories. There were months of affidavits and depositions and submissions and counter-submissions from Victor's lawyers, who were excellent and who fought the case at every stage the way expensive lawyers fought cases, by making the process as exhausting as possible for everyone involved. But the case itself was not vulnerable in the way Victor's lawyers needed it to be. The Marsh documentation was the wall they kept hitting. Victor could argue about interpretation, about context, about the technical meaning of certain contract language, but he could not argue with his own handwritten instructions to his own employee, directing the alteration of documents that had then been submitted to the territorial registry under false notarization. The instructions existed. They were in Victor's handwriting. Marsh had kept them for 3 years under a floorboard in his house, which was the single most useful act of self-preservation anyone had performed in this entire affair. Through the summer, Mabel maintained the correspondence, tracked the submissions, communicated with Carver, and managed the parts of the case that lived in paper and language. Ronan managed the parts that required presence in the physical world. 2 trips to Cheyenne for depositions, 1 to Denver for a meeting with Caldwell, who had come north as part of the Federal Circuit review. She asked him, when he came back from Denver, what the city had felt like. He thought about it. Smaller, he said. She understood what he meant, not geographically, in the sense that the scale by which you measured things shifted when you had spent a year in the mountains, and places that had seemed large and significant recalibrated accordingly. Did you go past the house? She asked. Your family's house? He looked at her. No. Did you want me to? No, she said, and meant it. She wrote to her parents regularly, carefully, in language that conveyed that she was managing and that the situation was developing in a positive direction without making promises she wasn't certain she could keep. Her mother wrote back with the same careful management of language, which Mabel recognized as her mother's love expressed in the only mode available to a woman who had been taught that direct emotional expression was a form of indulgence. Her father wrote less often, but more fully, and his letters had changed. There was less pride management in them, less performance of composure. He wrote like a man who had had something stripped away and was still deciding whether the core underneath it was worth building on. She thought it probably was. She wrote that carefully in her next letter. Margaret's response came in July. It was 2 pages, written in a hand that Mabel did not know, and it was addressed to both of them. She had been calling herself Ruth for 3 years, and the name had become hers in the way that chosen things sometimes become more truly yours than given things. She said she was glad they had written. She said she had read the letter 4 times before she believed it was what it appeared to be. She said she did not want to come back to Colorado, not yet, possibly not ever, but that she was grateful to know the case was moving and that Victor's ability to do what he had done to her to anyone else was being removed. She said one more thing, near the end. She said that she had built something in Mill Haven, small and imperfect, and not what she would have designed for herself, but real. A job she was good at, neighbors who knew her name, a cat she had taken in from the cold the previous winter, who was now, apparently, the most demanding resident of her household. She said that building things under difficult circumstances was something she had not understood she was capable of until the circumstances forced her to find out. Ronan read that paragraph twice. She sounds like herself, he said, which was not something Mabel had any framework to evaluate, not having known the before version of Margaret. But she could hear what it meant to him. The specific relief of recognizing someone in their words after a long absence. "She's all right," Mabel said. "She's all right," he agreed. Victor Hale's formal indictment on federal fraud charges was filed in September. Carver sent the documentation with a cover letter that was, for a man of his careful professional language, almost something approaching satisfaction in its tone. The indictment covered the systematic alteration of contracted documents, the fraudulent notarization scheme, the deliberate structuring of debt instruments to transfer liability to parties who had not agreed to those terms, and the concealment of assets across multiple jurisdictions. There were additional charges related to the circumstances of his marriage to Margaret Ferris. Dorothea's statement had been sufficient to open that avenue, and once it was open, Caldwell's federal investigators had found more. Victor's lawyers negotiated. Victor, it emerged in the negotiations, was not a man who faced consequences well. The performance of composure that had served him for so many years in so many parlors and offices was not a mechanism that held under the specific pressure of a federal case with this particular documentation. By November, he had agreed to a plea arrangement that required the surrender of all assets acquired through the fraudulent scheme, restitution to the families affected, which included Thomas Whitmore's estate, and a period of federal imprisonment. He did not go to a territorial jail. He went somewhere considerably less comfortable, which was, Mabel thought, accurate. The restitution to her father was not everything that had been lost. She wanted to be clear about that, because she was always more interested in accurate accounting than in satisfying narrative. The Whitmore family would not return to the financial position they had held before Victor's scheme. Some of what had been lost was simply gone, invested and spent in good faith before the fraud became apparent, evaporated in the way money evaporated when attached to schemes that were never real. What came back was enough for the house, for stability, for a foundation. It was not restoration, it was a base to rebuild from. She wrote to her father when she knew the amount because she wanted him to have accurate information rather than false hope. His letter back was the shortest he had ever written her. It said, "Your mother and I are grateful for what you did. I did not understand when you left what you were going into or what you were capable of. I understand better now. Come and see us when you can." She read it sitting at the kitchen table in the early winter light, with the smell of the first real snow of the season coming through the gaps around the window, and she felt something move through her that she had not felt in a long time, a specific kind of grief for the years when her father had not seen her clearly, and underneath it, something warmer. Not forgiveness exactly, because she had not been carrying the weight of unforgiveness in a way that required that word. More like resolution. The settling of an account that had been open for a long time. She would go and see them. Not yet, but she would go. Ronan came in from the barn and looked at her at the table with the letter in her hand. "Good news?" he said. "Good enough," she said. He poured himself coffee and came to sit across from her, which was the place he always sat now, so habitually that she couldn't remember when it had stopped being a choice and become simply where he was. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. "All right." She had been thinking about this for several weeks, turning it over in the way she turned things over. Thoroughly, from multiple angles, checking it for weak points. It was not a weak proposal. It had gotten stronger the more she examined it. "The timber contract you run with the mill in Croft Valley," she said. "How much of the upper timber is surveyed?" He looked at her, which was a specific look that meant she had surprised him by going somewhere he hadn't expected. "About a third," he said. "The rest is assessed, but not formally surveyed." "Yes, if it were surveyed properly, with documentation filed, and if the timber rights were organized under a formal business structure rather than an informal contract arrangement, what would the operation look like?" He was quiet for a moment. "Bigger," he said. "How much bigger?" He thought about it. He was not a man who answered questions of this kind carelessly. "Triple the current volume," he said. "Maybe more, depending on the eastern acreage. There's a stretch I haven't fully assessed." "I'd like to help you build that," she said. He looked at her across the table. "The correspondence infrastructure we built for the case," she said. The organizational systems, the cross-referencing, the documentation methodology, those don't stop being useful just because the case is resolved. A timber operation of the size you're describing would need exactly that kind of administrative structure to function properly. She held his gaze. I'm not suggesting I run your business. I'm suggesting we run it together. The fire moved in the grate. The snow that was coming pressed against the window in small preliminary gusts. You could go back to Denver, Ronan said. Your family's situation is stable now. You have the option. I know I have the option, she said. I'm telling you what I want to do with it. The mountains aren't easy, he said. I'm aware of the mountains, she said. He held her gaze steadily, and she held his. And this was the conversation they were having, and also the other conversation that ran underneath it. The one that neither of them was willing to put into words quite yet, because some things needed to build at their own pace without being rushed into language. I'll get the eastern acreage surveyed in the spring, he said. Good, she said. You'll need to learn the timber assessment system properly if you're going to work with the documentation. Show me, she said. It takes time. I have time, she said. I live here. He looked at her for one more moment, then he picked up his coffee. After the snow settles, he said, I'll show you the eastern stretch first. It's the most complex. After the snow, she agreed. They sat together in the kitchen with the winter coming in around the house, and the account books were on the shelf waiting, and the mountain was enormous outside the window. And it was a completely ordinary evening in the life of two people who were figuring out, without hurrying, what they were building together. This was not a story that ended with everything fixed. She wanted to say that plainly because she had lived inside it and she knew the texture of it, and the texture was not the texture of fixed. Her father was rebuilding from a foundation rather than from the former height. Her mother was adjusting to a diminished social world with the particular dignity of a woman who had always known that dignity was something you constructed, not something given. Margaret Ferris. Ruth, she reminded herself, Ruth was the name the woman had chosen, was making a life in a Utah town under a name that fit her better now than the original. Victor Hale was in a federal prison. His empire was distributed among its victims. His name, which had been spoken in Denver with a specific kind of deference, was spoken now with a different kind of specificity. None of this was tidy. The restitution did not erase the years. Margaret's freedom did not restore what those years in that house had taken from her. The Whitmore family name was cleared, but the social world that had surrounded it was smaller and would not return to its former dimensions. Real life did not return things to their original condition. It moved forward from wherever it had been damaged, building new structures on changed ground. And what you got was not the original, but something else. Something that carried the marks of what had happened and was sometimes stronger in the broken places and sometimes just scarred. And the difference between those outcomes was not always visible from the outside. What she had learned, in this year in the mountains, was something she had suspected for a long time but had never had the conditions to confirm. She had always been capable of this. Of the legal analysis and the organizational thinking and the careful correspondence and the rifle held at the ready position in the morning cold. Of managing fear without being ruled by it. Of building trust slowly and deliberately with a man who operated the same way. Of understanding systems, financial, legal, social, and identifying where they were broken and what could be done about the breaking. She had always been capable of it. She had simply been placed, for the first 23 years of her life, in conditions that were not suited to it. Conditions that measured her by entirely wrong instruments and found her wanting by those instruments. And she had spent years half believing the measurement. The world had told her she was too much, too large, too present, too impossible to fit into the shapes available. What the world had actually been saying, she understood now, was that the shapes were wrong. The shapes were built for something smaller and less complicated and less true, and she had never been going to fit them, and the failure had been entirely the shapes. She was not grateful to Victor Hale. She wanted to be precise about that. She was not one of those people who believed that suffering was a gift because of what it produced. The damage Victor had done was real damage, to real people, and no outcome made it worth having happened. But she was grateful for this mountain, for this house with its wide plank floors and its east-facing window and its kitchen garden that she was learning the character of with her hands in the earth. For Asa Croft, who directed most of his conversation to her and offered her coffee first. For the gray mare, who had trusted her on the ridge. For the wooden box of documents that had been her first real work commensurate with her actual capacity, in a life that had not previously offered her much of that. For Ronan Blackwood, who had looked at her in that Denver parlor, not with assessment, not with inventory, and seen a person he was speaking to. He was not a simple man, and their life was not a simple life, and she had no interest in simplifying either of those things in her own accounting of them. He was difficult in the specific ways that people were difficult when they had been alone a long time, and had organized the world around that aloneness. He did not always remember to share information he had decided was not worrying enough to share. He had a stubbornness about certain physical matters, his own comfort, his own limitations, that she had been addressing directly and would continue to address directly because indirection was not her language, and they had established that plainness was the operating mode between them. She was difficult too. She was not modest about that. She had a tendency to work ahead of where the conversation was, to have already decided on an approach before the other person had finished presenting the problem, which was efficient and occasionally premature. She held certain things, her fears, the specific textures of her uncertainties, closer than she probably needed to, a habit from years in environments where vulnerability had been used against her. They were two people who had each learned to manage alone and were now learning, slowly, how to manage together, and it was not smooth and it was not always comfortable, and it was the most genuinely engaged she had ever been in her life. The spring survey of the eastern acreage happened in March, 2 years after she had arrived. The snow that year came late into the season, which Ronan said was unusual, and they had a window of relatively clear weather in the second week of March that allowed them to cover the full eastern stretch on horseback in 3 days. She had learned the timber assessment system over the winter. She could read the markers now, could distinguish the standing volume in a stand by sight with enough accuracy for planning purposes, could identify disease and damage and estimate harvest timing. She was not as fast as Ronan at the physical reading of it, which was a matter of years, and she was patient, but she was faster at the documentation, and she caught things in the pattern of the survey data that led her to suggest a harvesting sequence that had not occurred to him and that, when he examined it, improved the efficiency of the operation considerably. She wrote this up and sent it to the mill contact in Croft Valley with a business proposal attached. The mill contact, a man who had known Ronan for 15 years and who had initially conducted all correspondence through Ronan, had gradually, over the preceding months, begun to address his letters to them both, which she took as the kind of acknowledgement that practical men offered when the evidence made ignoring it inconvenient. Asa Croft came for dinner that spring and brought his wife, a woman named Helen, who had strong opinions about vegetable cultivation, and who examined Mabel's kitchen garden with a critical eye and then announced several specific improvements she would help implement, which she then did over the following 2 weeks without being asked again. Helen became the first friend Mabel made in the high country, in the way friends were made when you were both practical people who respected directness, by working alongside each other on real things and finding the working compatible. The formal business structure for the Blackwood Timber Company was filed with the Territorial Registry in April. Mabel had written the articles of organization herself, with Carver's review, and she had made sure the documentation was thorough in the specific way she now understood documentation needed to be thorough, cross-referenced, properly witnessed, leaving no ambiguity in the language that could be exploited later by anyone who found ambiguity useful. The articles listed 2 principals, Ronan Blackwood and Mabel Blackwood. She had looked at her name on the document for a moment when she wrote it for the final time, not with the strangeness she had felt on the letter to Dorothea Price in those early months, with something that felt simply accurate, like a correct measurement. Ruth wrote from Millhaven twice that spring. Her letters had lost some of the careful reserve of the first one, not entirely, but enough to suggest that she was deciding, incrementally, to trust the correspondence. She mentioned the cat, whose name was apparently Biscuit, and whose personality she described with a dry specificity that made Mabel laugh at the kitchen table in a way that startled the dog they had acquired over the winter, a large, opinionated animal named Hector, who had arrived as a stray during a snowstorm and had simply remained. In her second spring letter, Ruth mentioned that she was teaching a young woman in Millhaven to sew, that she found the teaching unexpectedly satisfying, that she thought she might take on another student. Mabel wrote back and said that sounded like the beginning of something. Ruth wrote back and said, "Maybe it is." That summer, Mabel's parents came to visit. This had been her mother's idea, which surprised Mabel slightly. Eleanor Whitmore had always found the frontier conceptually alarming, associated it in her mind with hardship and disorder, and everything that the carefully constructed world of Denver society was designed to keep at bay. But she had written in May to say that she and Thomas would come in July, if that was convenient, and she would like to see where Mabel was living. They came for 10 days. Her father walked the property with Ronan on the first day, just the two of them, for several hours. She did not ask what they talked about. She could see, when they came back, that something had been exchanged between them that sat better on both their faces than what had been there before. Her mother examined the house with the thoroughness of a woman who expressed love through practical assessment. She noted the things that were working and the things that needed attention, and she offered opinions about both in a tone that was, by Eleanor Whitmore's standards, quite warm. On the third day, she helped Mabel put up a batch of preserves from the early summer garden, and they worked side by side at the stove for an afternoon in a companionable silence that Mabel realized was the most comfortable she had ever been in her mother's company. On the last evening of the visit, her mother sat with her on the porch in the long summer light and looked at the mountain for a while without speaking. Then she said, "You're happy here." It was not entirely a question, but it was partly a question. Mabel considered it seriously, because her mother deserved a serious answer. "I'm not sure happy is the right word," she said. She paused, looking for the accurate thing. "I'm real here. I feel like myself in a way I didn't before." "That's not the same as happy exactly, but it's better." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know," she said. "How much we—" She stopped, started again. "How much the city wasn't right for you. I thought you were—" "I know what you thought," Mabel said, not harshly. "It's all right, Mama." "It's not entirely all right," her mother said, "but I'm glad you found this." Mabel looked at her mother's profile in the evening light. The careful way she held herself, even now, even out here with no one watching. The posture of a woman who had been taught that composure was a form of character and had never entirely been able to put it down. "I know," Mabel said. "I'm glad too." The timber operation expanded through that second year in ways that the business proposal had projected and then slightly exceeded. The harvesting sequence Mabel had designed proved efficient in practice, and the documentation systems allowed them to manage the increased volume without the operational confusion that typically accompanied growth. They hired 2 men, one for the physical timber work, one for the mill transport, and she found that managing people was something she had more instinct for than she would have predicted, possibly because she had spent so many years being managed poorly and understood viscerally what the alternative looked like. Ronan was a good partner in the operational sense. He was not territorial about it, which she had been a little worried about in those early months of building the business structure. Some men were, even men who were not otherwise difficult, because the business was the place where certain old ideas about authority lived longest. He understood quickly that her instincts and his were complementary rather than competing, that her tendency to work in the documentation layer and his in the physical reality layer produced better results together than either did alone. They argued about things. That was the other truth of it. Not violently, not destructively, but directly, and sometimes at length, about harvesting decisions, about which contracts were worth taking, about whether to expand toward the north acreage in the 3rd year or wait. I was more conservative than she was in his estimates, and she was more aggressive, and they found, through argument, a middle position that was usually better than either starting point. She had never had that before. The experience of genuine argument with someone who wasn't trying to win or to manage her, who was trying to get to the right answer and understood that her perspective was part of the material from which right answers were constructed. It was a small thing to name. It was not a small thing to have. There was a moment in the late autumn of that 2nd year that she returned to, sometimes when she was trying to understand what had changed and how. They had been working late, as they often did in the weeks before winter settled in and made certain kinds of work impossible. The lamps were low, the fire was good, and Hector the dog was doing his habitual impersonation of a creature who had never been warm and could not believe his luck. The account books were open between them, and she had been running figures for the spring projection, and she looked up for a moment and found Ronan looking at her. Not at the books, at her. With the expression that had lived between surprise and something else, that she had first noticed across a table in the Denver parlor when he had set down those debt documents. It had the same quality now as it had then, except that what surrounded it was different. Months of shared work and shared difficulty, and the specific intimacy of two people who had been honest with each other about their actual natures rather than the versions they had prepared for public consumption. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Ronan." He looked at the fire for a moment. "I was thinking," he said, "that I didn't know what this was going to be. When I came to Denver, I had a plan, and I knew the legal logic, and I knew you were in a bad position, and I needed to move you out of it. But I didn't know—" He stopped, and the stopping was not uncertainty about the words, but about whether to give them. She waited. "I didn't know what you were going to be," he said. "I knew the situation. I didn't know you." She looked at him across the table with the lamplight and the account books and Hector's enormous impractical presence on the rug. "And now you do," she said. "Some of you," he said, "more than when I started." "That's accurate," she said. "Same for me." He held her gaze. "Is this—" He stopped again. "Say it plainly," she said, because that was always what she said to him when he got to the edge of something and hesitated. "Is this what you would have chosen?" he said. "If you'd had all the choices, not the situation, not the constraint. If you'd been free to go anywhere and build anything from the beginning, would it have been this?" She looked around the room, the wide plank floors she had come to know the sound of, the east window. The shelves organized in the way of a person who understood that order in a remote location was not aesthetics, but function. The man across the table from her who was asking her a real question and waiting for a real answer. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what I would have found if I'd had all the choices from the beginning. I might have found something good. I might have found something smaller than this and not known it was smaller." She held his gaze. What I know is that this is mine. This work, this place, this—" She paused. "This. It's mine in a way that nothing was before. And I'm not interested in a version of my life where I don't have it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good," and looked back at the account books. She looked back at the account books too. After a moment, Hector stood up, turned around 3 times for reasons known only to himself, and lay back down in exactly the same position. The lamp burned low. Outside, the mountain was going into another winter. Indifferent and enormous and not hostile, she had come to understand. Not hostile at all, only itself. Just large. Just permanent in the way the best things were permanent. Not unchanged, but enduring. Shaped by what came at it. Shaped by weather and time and the press of seasons, and remaining, through all of it, essentially and unmistakably what it had always been. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stood at the Denver window in the pre-dawn dark, watching the gray frozen street and feeling the last version of her life dissolve. How that woman had made a list in her head because it was the only thing available to her. How she had packed the practical things and left the good dresses behind. She had been right about the dresses. She had been right about more than she knew. What no one had told her, what no one could have told her, because she would not have believed it yet, was that the dissolving of that version of her life was not the disaster it had looked like from inside it. That the constraints she had spent 23 years straining against were not the shape of her life, but the cage around it. And that cages could be broken if you were willing to ride 4 days into the mountains with a stranger and learn to hold a rifle and put your hands in difficult ground and trust, slowly and carefully and with evidence, the people who deserved it. She had been called too much her entire life. She had turned out to be exactly enough. Not because the world had finally recognized it. The world, large and impersonal as the mountain, did not orient itself toward individual reckoning. What had happened was simpler and more durable than recognition. She had built something real with her own hands and her own mind in the place where she actually was, not the place she had been expected to occupy. She had found the work commensurate with her capacity. She had found the person whose presence made the work better, and whose presence she made better in return. That was not a small outcome. That was, in the accounting of actual human lives, as opposed to the stories told about them, quite a large one. The mountain held its snow. The lamps burned low. Mabel Blackwood turned a page in the account